is not obnoxious. The kids don't decide. It's good to see everybody here tonight. We're thankful that you could all make it this evening. I have a pretty good number of attendants. We're glad to see the Vines back. We're really happy their health has permitted them to be here. And David made it back safely. Good to see Sharon too again. And it's also really good to see part of my family here. It's my honor to introduce tonight my son-in-law, Aaron Stice from the Lithia Springs congregation. He is I guess the title is assistant preacher or something to that effect. And he wears several hats. I think he's also, the associate preacher. He also wears the hat of youth director and things like that. And we're glad he's here. I've probably mentioned many times before how proud I am of him that he has become a gospel preacher. When I first met him, or right after we met, he went into the Air Force and even ended up doing a tour of duty over in Kuwait and Iraq, and it's a veteran of that conflict over there. So I'm really proud of him, but especially because he's a gospel preacher. But I have to also say I'm proud of my daughter, Melissa, that she's also a gospel preacher. And I say that seriously. I was not there, but this past Saturday I heard she did a good job. So it gave me the idea that the men of the congregation will all go, as soon as I dismiss us here, to the back, into the annex, and let Aaron preach for us. And Melissa will preach for the women. Well, I didn't mention that. Well, maybe we'll do that on another occasion then. But tonight I think the subject will be the miracles of Jesus concerning that, and we're all excited about that. Without robbing any more of his time, Aaron.
Well, like always, it's good to see y'all. You know, this is kind of where I guess we would call roots with the family. And, you know, this was the very first place that I held a gospel meeting. And, you know, this is kind of the whole initiation point of me doing preaching. And so I'm grateful to be back here with you today. You know, it's almost fitting that I'm speaking about miracles. With the way that the topic worked, you guys had "Behold the Man," and then I had "And His Miracles," and so it's kind of almost a miracle in and of itself that I even preach. Of course, a lot of people would probably be saying that if you had the opportunity to speak to people who knew me before. You know, it's a miracle that I'm up here. It's a miracle that Melissa preached on Saturday for those ladies. Let me tell you, that week leading up to it, I did not foresee that going to happen, but you know there is indeed a need for us to understand miracles in more of a sense of the biblical understanding of miracles. Now we could pick a number of different ways to discuss miracles, and I could make this real short and say I don't understand how miracles work, and so there you go, and we could call that the end. But I think there is some very interesting things that we can get from miracles. You know, the Bible only gives us a small amount of miracles. In fact, in Matthew chapter 4 and verse 32, we see that Jesus was going throughout Galilee in the synagogues, and there he was preaching, and he was teaching about the kingdom, the gospel of the kingdom, and he was healing. And that's what Matthew chapter 4 verse 32 says, is that he was just healing every kind of disease and sickness among the people. Then, of course, if we go to John chapter 20 and verse 30, we see that there were many other signs. You know, miracles and signs are kind of used interchangeably in some ways. There is some differentiations made sometimes, but that concept there is that there were many others that were done by Jesus before the apostles. You know, it's interesting that Jesus chose miracles in the way that he did. You know, I know that we had some young ones kind of walk out, but I wanted to show you something. Now, this isn't a miracle, but this is just kind of to help get a little bit of perspective. Okay, I've got a penny. In my hand right here, a penny. Now I can take, with my miraculous abilities, I can take and make you pick the wrong hand every single time with just a single penny. If I hold my hands out and made you choose one, you would choose the wrong hand every single time. In fact, I'll put my hands behind my back and I'll let Ava come up here and pick a hand. Come on up here, Ava. Which hand is the penny in? Oh, let's try again. Which hand is the penny in? Choose wisely. This one right here? I'm sorry, it's right here. All right, let's try again, okay? Third time's a charm, right? This one? Are you sure it's this one? Because it's right here. You want to try one more time? Okay. Go ahead and pick. This one right here? It's right there. Go ahead and sit down. You know, of course it's no trick. I had 2 pennies. I'm no magician. And the funny thing is that neither was Jesus. You know, and I believe that in a lot of senses we have a number of people who don't believe in Jesus' miracles because they attribute them to the same kind of idea as a magician. Someone that's able to pull something over their eyes. And of course, you know, from a faith perspective, understand that not to be true. And in fact, there are records of throughout the Gospels of different miracles that were performed. We see that there is no doubt that Jesus existed and that Jesus was a person, even that the Jews described, who had extraordinary abilities. And some of them would go as far as to try to murder our Christ because of those. You know, but in fact, we need to know and understand that Jesus was no magician at all. How many of y'all have ever seen the show Penn and Teller Fool Us? You ever heard of that? It's something that I stumbled across not too long ago. It's a show where magicians get up. Of course, Penn and Teller are very famous magicians. They've been doing magic for a number of different years, and these people will study in order to get onto this show in order to perform in front of Penn and Teller. The whole purpose in mind is to fool Penn and Teller. Make it to where they can't catch what the trick was. Make it to where they don't understand how that person performed that magic. And these people will sometimes do it. Sometimes Penn and Teller will tell them right from the get-go, we know how you're doing that. It's no secret. But I was watching one not too long ago. The young man got up and he was doing actually a card trick. And it was actually a very interesting card trick. And he had them floating around and all kinds of different stuff. And afterwards, Penn and Teller both said, we have no idea how you've done that. And the guy, of course, won the show. And as the girl that came out to congratulate him on winning the show, she started asking him questions about that. She said, how did you do this? He said, first, it took me 4 years worth of study and practice to be able to perform that one trick. To be able to perform it in such a way that Penn and Teller and no one else would be able to detect how he was making that happen. You know, folks, if it takes 4 years for someone to be able to take and learn a trick well enough to fool 2 of the best magicians in all of our world at this current moment, then certainly we can begin to see as we look through these miracles that Jesus wasn't just a magician. It wasn't one trick. It wasn't a handful of tricks. Folks, Jesus was able to perform miracles. And we'll kind of look at that. You know, there is a vast variety of miracles that Jesus did. And I found a breakdown of these, and this is really interesting. Of the specific miracles recorded in the 4 Gospels that we find, there are 17 where there were bodily cures. 6 were healings of some kind of demonic possession. 9 were miracles of nature, where he commanded nature. And there were 3 occasions where he raised someone from the dead. Folks, we're not talking about simply being able to pull things over their eyes. We're not talking about a one trick. We're talking about something that was able to be seen, felt, and that news would spread because people believed it. You know, in fact, of the 17 specific healings the healing miracles are recorded, there is a variety of different illnesses even that Jesus healed. Look at these. Leprosy, paralysis, fever, shriveled limbs, and amputated ear even, blindness, deafness, muteness, and blood hemorrhaging. You know, folks, if we had even half of that ability today in our medical fields, we would be doing amazing. But yet Jesus, just with the power of a word, in some cases was able to heal that. You know, it's an interesting thing about miracles, and this is kind of where I wanted to take us with today. Again, I can't tell you how Jesus performed miracles. As I was talking with a couple of people about this, you know, I've always wondered, and maybe you'll wonder this too, when Jesus fed the 5,000, and he had that basket of the fish and loaves, when he handed a basket out, did another basket miraculously appear in his hand? I've always wondered that. You know, it's kind of funny. It's someone that once asked me, you know, if there was ever a genie and you could ask the genie for one wish, what would it be? Maybe you guys have been asked something similar like that. And of course, genies aren't real, and this is all hypothetical. I always told them, well, I would want to be able to open my wallet and there would be $1,000. Every time I opened it, $1,000. Now that's a gift that you ask a genie if there were one. You know, how would you do that? Would you open it and then there'd be $1,000 just miraculously appear there in front of you? Was that what happened with the fish and the loaves? Is that what happened? You think about Lazarus being raised from the dead. You know, it was when it talks about he had been in the grave for 4 days, he was starting to smell. And when Jesus said, Lazarus, come out, what happened to the smell? What happened to the deterioration that had already started of the body, the rigor mortis that would have certainly set in? Was it a visible thing that you could see that instantly changed there in front of your eyes? I don't know. I don't know how God was able to make those miracles happen. I don't know how Jesus was able to do that. But what I can tell you that we can gather some really interesting information from the fact that he did. In fact, what I wanted to show through these miracles is that Jesus had authority. And we'll look at a couple of different types of authority that Jesus had. And we're going to really be bringing these from Matthew chapter 8 and chapter 9. If you want to go ahead and turn there, that's where the predominance of our study is going to come from. You know, there are 3 different cases of Jesus raising someone from the dead. And we'll look at this with a little more depth here in just a few moments, but I want you to see something quickly with me. Jesus had the authority over life and death. There's three different occasions. Of course, in Matthew chapter 9, verses 18 through 16, we see Jairus' daughter who had just died. In Luke chapter 7, verses 11 through 15, we see the widow of Nain's son who was in the coffin already. And then, of course, we see Lazarus in John chapter 11 who had been in the tomb for 4 days. You ever wondered why the writers, if the miracles were not true, why the writers would write them in such a way where you have someone who has just died, someone who has already died and then put in a coffin, and then someone who had died and then buried? Kind of an interesting concept here, but it shows that Jesus has authority no matter how long you've been dead. You know, but Jesus really, he had authority over all things, didn't he? Of course, in Matthew chapter 28, and before Jesus is ascending into heaven, he says, all authority has been given unto me. And then he goes and he sends the disciples onto the Great Commission. You know, all authority has been given unto me. But I want us to see some authority that Jesus had. Beginning in Matthew chapter 8, we're going to look at verses 2 and 3 here. I want us to see that Jesus had authority over incurable diseases. Not just diseases that can sometimes be misconstrued. You know, if you turn on the TV and you flip through the channels, you're almost bound to land on someone who is claiming that they can heal. And you'll see it. I think if you've ever heard of the name Benny Hill, he's got that jacket. He whips people with it, I guess. Is that his name, Benny Hill?
Ben.
Ben! See? It's a good thing. How do y'all know that? Benny Hill. He's got that jacket, and he whips people with that jacket, and they all fall over, and people will walk up with crutches, and he'll hit them with the jacket, and the crutches will fall down, and that person will be dancing around. Folks, Jesus wasn't a magician. He wasn't trying to fool anyone. Beginning in verse 2 of Matthew chapter 8, and behold, a leper came to him and knelt before him, saying, Lord, if you will. Lord, first of all, which is interesting. This person already had faith in who Jesus was. Lord, if you will, you can make me clean. And Jesus stretched out his hand and touched him. Now, I don't know how much you know about lepers, but they are not to be touched. Leprosy is not a disease that you want. It is not a disease that is fun. In fact, it is incurable. There was a young man who was graduating from the Memphis School of Preaching. Ronnie Goodnam is his name. Came and spoke with us at Lithia Springs, and he was telling us about how in India there is a leper colony there, and how there is a minister there that works with that leper colony. And he was talking about it and describing in some cases how terrible this leprosy is. See, because you have to be removed from your family, just like those in the biblical days had to be removed from their, completely cut off, knowing they would never get to see their friends and families again. You know, even in the way that we're told in the Bible, they had to wear cloaks across their face, and they had to walk on the opposite side of the street, and they had to tell people they were unclean. Folks, this wasn't a faked limp. This wasn't some kind of a joke with crutches. This was a person with a disease that would cause fingers and toes to fall completely off their body. Jesus, being who he was, reached out and touched him. That's almost a miracle in and of itself, but really it shows the compassion of our Lord. Can you imagine the last time that that person had been touched by another human being? Jesus reached out and touched him, saying, I will be clean. And the Bible, Matthew describes it as immediately his leprosy was cleaned or cleansed. You know, so Jesus had the ability to cure incurable diseases. But interestingly enough, Jesus didn't even have to touch you to be clean. Continuing on in Matthew chapter 8, read with me verses 5 through 13. Beginning in verse 5, when he entered Capernaum, a centurion came forward to him, appealing to him, Lord, my servant is lying paralyzed at home, suffering terribly. And he said to him, I will come and heal him. But the centurion replied, Lord, I am not worthy to have you under my roof, but only say the word, and my servant will be healed. For I too am a man under authority with soldiers under me, and I say to one, go, and he goes, and to another, come, and he comes, and to my servant, do this, and he does it. And when Jesus heard this, he marveled and said to those who followed him, truly I tell you, with no one in Israel have I found such faith. I tell you, many will come from the east and west, recline at the table with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in the kingdom of heaven, while the sons of the kingdom will be thrown into outer darkness. In this place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. And to the centurion Jesus said, go, let it be done for you as you have believed. Now, look at the end of that verse. And the servant was healed at that very moment. You know, folks, what is so interesting about this is that Jesus here proves that he is not only having the authority over illness, the authority over ailments of disease, but Jesus has the authority over time and space. This isn't just a man. This is God in the flesh. If you look at John chapter 1, you will begin to find that in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And He was in the beginning there with God. And all things were made through Him. See, folks, Jesus had the authority over space and time from the beginning, but here Jesus demonstrated through His abilities of miracles to prove it. He doesn't even have to be in the same room in order to heal somebody. Imagine having the faith of that centurion and being able to go up to Jesus and say, Lord, I know that all you have to do is say it. I know that you don't even have to come to my house. I put so much faith in you, God, that you can do it from here. You know, I know this is a lesson about miracles, but man, what kind of a lesson do we get from faith on that? Many of us wouldn't have that kind of faith if Jesus was standing right in front of us. He is the Lord of space and time. But on top of that, He's the Lord of nature. Continuing in chapter 8, look with me down in verse 23. It says, and when He got into the boat, His disciples followed Him, and behold, there arose a great storm on the sea, so that the boat was being swamped by the waves, but He was asleep. Of faith. You know what's funny is I was one time coming into Dallas, Texas, on an airplane. And as we fly into this airport there in Dallas, of course it's kind of there between Dallas and Fort Worth, if any of y'all have ever been there. Apparently there were tornadoes on the ground as we were going to land. And I had fallen asleep sometime outside of Atlanta and was there just knocked out on this airplane. And I wake up to the plane just shaking like crazy. People screaming. The lady across the aisle from me was like clutching her things, crying. Oh, she was in tears. She thought it was the end of the world. I can almost sympathize with the way Jesus reacted in this case. When He wakes up and He says, why are you so afraid? Oh, you of little faith. You know, and I guess maybe that's the Air Force in me. Give me a turbulent ride. It's going to be a lot more fun that way. It gets boring whenever you just go up there and don't do nothing. We were coming back from, and I won't tell too many stories. We got a lot of stuff to cover. We were coming back from Panama one time on a mission trip. And I was lucky to have my father with me at that time. And I don't know if many of y'all have met my father. Really kind of an interesting guy. You wouldn't think very much of him if you just kind of knew him from a distance. That guy used to be on the United States Air Force Thunderbirds, the aerial demonstration team. We used to tell me about stories about how they would pull G's through the airs, and they would do loops and swoop down things. He would tell me stories about how they would stand at the end of the runway and let one of the jets fly over top of them as low as they could go, and whoever ducked had to buy coffee. Well, I'm riding with my dad, coming back from Panama, and we're in this big plane. And I don't know what happened, but at some point, the airplane in the sky began to free fall. Not nosedive, but free fall, drop out of the air. As soon as the plane begins to drop, my dad throws his hands in the air and goes, "Whee!" You know, sometimes we got to have a little bit of faith, don't we? Now, of course, I don't know if he expected the plane to catch air again or not, but he was going to go out laughing, I guess. I don't know. Going back to chapter 8, in verse 25, they went and woke him, saying, "Save us, Lord, we are perishing. Remember, the winds and the waves are crashing into this boat, and this boat is surely going to sink in their minds, and they are doomed." In verse 26, and he said to them, "Why are you afraid, O you of little faith?" Then he rose and rebuked the winds and the sea, and there was a great calm. And the men marveled, saying, "What sort of man is this that even the winds and sea obey him?" You know, Jesus had power over all of the things natural. But Jesus also had power over the supernatural. Look with me in verse 28. "And when he came to the other side, to the country of the Gadarens, 2 demon-possessed men met him coming out of the tomb, so fierce that no one could pass that way. And behold, they cried, 'What have you to do with us, O Son of God? Have you come here to torment us before the time?' In verse 30, "Now a herd of many pigs were feeding at some distance from them. And the demons begged him, saying, 'If you cast us out, send us away into the herd of pigs.' And he said to them, 'Go.' So they came out and went into the pigs. And behold, the whole herd rushed down the steep bank into the sea and drowned in the waters." Verse 33, "The herdsmen fled, and going to the city, they told everything, especially what had happened to the demon-possessed men." You know, Jesus had the power over the supernatural, not just the natural. And what I find so interesting is, and so odd, that even the demons here were willing to recognize Christ as Lord. Why do we have such a hard time doing the same? I meet people who will look at the Bible, who will read the words, who will try to understand what Jesus is trying to tell us in here, and simply just turn it and walk away. You know, folks, if we just allowed our faith, and not just our faith, we would be able to understand exactly why Christ was here and what he was sent for. Of course, we also see that Jesus had the authority over the forgiveness of sins and even genetics and biology, beginning in chapter 9. Y'all didn't expect to have to read this much, did you? Beginning in chapter 9, verse 1. "And getting into a boat, he crossed over and came to his own city. And behold, some people brought him a paralytic laying on a bed. And when Jesus saw their faith, he said to the paralytic, 'Take heart, my son, your sins are forgiven.' And behold, some of the scribes said to themselves, 'This man is blaspheming.' But Jesus, knowing their thoughts, said, 'Why do you think evil in your hearts? For which is easier to say, your sins, or to say, rise and walk? But that you may know that the Son of Man has authority on earth to forgive sins,' he then said to the paralytic, 'Rise, pick up your bed, and go home.' Verse 7, "And he rose and went home. When the crowd saw it, they were afraid, and they glorified God, who had given such authority to men." Look down with me in verse 27. "And Jesus passed from there, 2 blind men following him, crying aloud, 'Have mercy on us, Son of David.' And when he had entered the house, the blind men came to him, and Jesus said to them, 'Do you believe that I am able to do this?' They said to him, 'Yes, Lord.' Then he touched their eyes, saying, 'According to your faith, be it done to you.' Verse 30, "And their eyes were opened, and Jesus sternly warned them, 'See that no one knows about this.' But they went away and spread his fame throughout the district." You know, folks, there is a lot of things that even in today's time, 2,000 years have passed since the time of Jesus walking on this earth. Many scientific studies have been done. Many scientific advancements have been made. We're able to take and splice genes. Not like what I'm wearing, but the code that makes us who we are on the biological sense. We're able to see gene expressions being turned on and off through different hormone regulations. We're able to take and see down to neurons. And Jesus was able to control every last bit of that. Now, we don't know what maybe caused the blindness or what caused the person to be paralyzed. It could have been genetics. It could have been something that was passed down from family to family. It could have been something that had happened to them. You know, I know of a person who I grew up with in high school who had gotten kicked by a horse. They're blind. You know, folks, we don't know what the cause was. But we know that Jesus, as the great physician, didn't have to sit there and ask a number of random questions. Is this something hereditary? Have you experienced any other kind of sensations? Is there something else that maybe you think could have helped attribute to this? No. Jesus just simply reached up, touched their eyes, and they were healed. Jesus had the authority to not only forgive sins, which we see here in chapter 9, but we see him on the cross. He had the ability to forgive sins, but on top of that, he had the ability to manipulate biology. Folks, that's amazing. That's probably the most interesting part of it all. And sometimes we maybe get looking at the big things, but Jesus was able to hone down to the smallest, tiny parts of us, down to our cellular level, and be able to fix us. To me, that's amazing. Absolutely amazing. Of course, we know that Jesus also had authority over life and death. As we saw from the beginning, he had healed 3, but in chapter 9, there is the example here beginning in verse 18. While he was saying these things to them, behold, a ruler came in and knelt before him, saying, "My daughter has just died. But come and lay your hand on her, and she will live." Verse 19, and Jesus rose and followed him with his disciples. And behold, a woman who had suffered discharge of blood for 12 years came up behind him and touched the fringe of his garment. For she said to herself, "If I only touch his garment, I will be made well." And instantly the woman was made well. Verse 23, and when Jesus came to the ruler's house and saw the flute players and the crowd making commotion, he said, "Go away, for the girl is not dead, but sleeping." Now, I want us to also remember that at this particular time, when Jesus comes onto the scene here, miracles weren't something that were happening very often. And there's been a series of time that has passed from the prophets till this time now when Jesus is walking the earth. And John the Baptist, of course, led the way. But John the Baptist led the way proclaiming that Jesus would come. It's not as though people were used to seeing things like this. Now, I want you to kind of put yourself in the shoes of those who were there in that room when Jesus walks in and Jesus says, "Look, she's just sleeping." Now, I've heard some tall tales before. I've seen some people try to sell me some really interesting things. I don't know how I would react right now if we were sitting here having a eulogy of some kind and someone walked through the door and said, "This person is just sleeping." I don't know how I would react. Maybe in the way that these people here did. Because we see the way that they look at Jesus, and in verse 25 or verse 24 it finishes, it says, "And they laughed at him." You know, maybe this is an opportunity for us to think about another thing. When we have the truth and we're willing to preach the truth, sometimes people are going to laugh. Sometimes people are going to say that we don't know what we're talking about. Sometimes people are going to try to disprove us. Folks, Jesus could have taken this as an insult and walked away. But he used faith here, the faith of the Father, in order to prove who he was. Verse 25, but when the crowd had been put outside, he went in and took her by the hand. And the girl arose. And the report of this went throughout all the district. You know, Jesus, of course, had power over life and over death. You know, he had power over being able to heal. He had power over being able to take and forgive sins. Of course, we read of the people being healed that were blind there in verse 33 and 32. You know, what I find so interesting about all of this is that we see Jesus' authority time and time again. You know, Jesus had the authority over incurable diseases, authority over space and time, authority over nature, authority over the supernatural realm, authority over our sins, authority over life and death, authority over the natural and the supernatural at the same time. And these varied miracles prove that Jesus has authority over all. But what's so interesting to me is that Jesus did not expect blind faith from his disciples. John chapter 20, verses 30 and 31 said, Jesus did many other signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not written in this book, but these are written so that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. You know, there may not be a whole lot we understand about how the miracles worked. It doesn't matter. We may not understand the subtle nuances of how Jesus affected the waves and the wind. We may not understand how Jesus was able to cure the blind or the leprosy or those that had an ear cut off. We may not understand how. But I can tell you why. Jesus did it because he did not expect you to have a blind faith. Jesus expected you to know that he was the Christ, not just believe that he was the Christ. You know, when we oftentimes make that statement, I believe that Jesus Christ is the only begotten Son of God, sometimes I'm afraid that many of us actually stick that in a realm of make-believe and not a realm of solid fact. I factually know that Jesus Christ is the Son of God. Not just because he proclaimed it, but because he had the authority to say that he was, and the authority to prove that he was. Now, what do we do with this kind of authority, or knowing of this kind of authority? Well, as Jesus left the earth, he made it clear, all authority has been given unto me. Go therefore into all the world and preach the gospel. Now, why would we preach? Because the authority was given by Christ for us to go and proclaim. The authority for us to teach who he was. The authority for us to baptize those who were believing in what we were telling them. Do we have the faith to put that authority into action? You know, I know that sometimes it would take a miracle for some people to come down and confess sins. You know, it's oftentimes the most underutilized privilege that we have as Christians. The ability to lean on each other. You know, and maybe it's just our culture. Maybe it's just the way that we were raised to not discuss our problems. You know, sometimes we have issues telling people what's wrong with us. I don't want to tell you I'm having a hard time. I don't want Brother Leroy to judge me. I don't want to tell you I'm having a problem with such and such. I don't want to tell you that my faith is weak. Sometimes it would take a miracle for us to trust each other. Maybe it's time that we let God have the authority. You know, Jesus tells us in 1 John chapter 1 that if we confess our sins, he is faithful and just to forgive us of those sins. You know, folks, it's high time we start listening to the authority of Christ. It is high time we start utilizing the ability that we have through his blood to be able to be connected one to another, to confess to one to another, to lean one on another, to rely one on another. You know, it's interesting that God, through Christ, created the church. Because I know for me personally, I would never be able to make it on my own. If I did not have my brothers and sisters who are there to help me, to lift me up when I'm feeling weak. And maybe that's you this evening. Maybe your faith has been weak. Maybe you just simply need the prayers of the church. You know, we're told to pray without ceasing. We're told the effectual fervent prayer of a righteous man availeth much. How much time do we spend in prayer with one another? Maybe you need that prayer this evening. You know, whatever your need is, we love you so much. I love you so much. Whatever we can do for you, why don't you come now while together we stand and while we sing.